Hi, this is Krishna. I'm the Director of Products for Sauce Labs, responsible for Autonomic. In this demo, we will take a look at Autonomic and we will do that using an example of Salesforce. If you think about testing in general, and if you go back about 20 years, most testing was done manually. Now, about 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, more so, automation became a common thing, and people switched from manual testing to automated testing. The advantage automated testing had over manual testing was that it took much less time to execute the test cases. For a serious application like Salesforce, where you could have hundreds or thousands of test cases, imagine having to execute that for every sprint cycle. With automation, that time was reduced significantly. However, there was still the part where you had to generate these automation scripts, where you had to create these automation scripts. Now, this part took a long time because you had to, first of all, get automation engineers to do the task for you. These automation engineers would take a long time to create these automation scripts. For example, it would take about 5 to 8 hours to create the automation script. And this is done by a specialist who knows Selenium or who knows some sort of an automation really, really well. When the application changes, which might happen every few weeks, every few months, a lot of these scripts that were created may start failing. And the reason for this is as the application changes, the underlying XPaths, the underlying references to the objects might change. And when this changes, the existing script, which is still referring to the old XPaths and old objects, no longer be able to identify the right elements, which will cause your executions to fail. It's a common practice in the industry to spend about 20% to 30% time maintaining scripts that were already created. And usually people account for this in their sprints as well. For a script that would take about 5 hours to create, it would take about an hour to just maintain the script from XPath and from object repository changes. Now, when the business logic changes, it's more complex than that. The flow itself might change. And when the flow changes, you may have to add, the manual tester adds the appropriate steps into the test case. The automation engineer adds the appropriate script into the automation script, which takes quite a bit of time. We noticed this about a few years ago, and then we realized that it needs a common solution to solve all these problems. And the solution that we came up with is Autonomic. Essentially, there is 6 key features of Autonomic, and these features are responsible for solving the problems we saw in the previous slide. And the first feature is being able to create automation scripts from an English test case. So the idea is, if you have a plain English test case, you can upload the test case into Autonomic. Autonomic's NLP engine can read English steps in the test case. It will understand the intention of the test case. It will then scan through the pages of the application, identify the elements, from the test case on these pages, and at the end of the day, you have the automation script created for your test cases. So that's the first feature, right? If you have English test cases, you can you can generate automation scripts from these English test cases using Autonomic. Now, test data is a key part of testing as well. In a typical complex application, when you have fields such as dates, or when you have fields such as names, sometimes you want to have unique data for these fields. If you don't have unique data, when you execute these scripts over and over again, the data might get stale, and this might cause executions to fail. So for example, let's say your application has a start date. Let's say you had hard-coded to yesterday's date. So when you were executing it yesterday, it was working fine, but today it's going to fail because the start date is in the past. So you want to be able to generate data on the fly dynamically so that your executions will never fail because of stale data. And Autonomic lets you do that. So Autonomic lets you generate data on the fly so that your executions will always have unique data and will never fail because of stale data. That's the first feature, being able to import these English test cases, generate automation scripts from these plain English test cases, and generate data as well for them. The second feature is being able to maintain these test cases over a period of time. Now, as I said, a common problem is as applications change, the underlying object information also changes. And when the object information changes, you are responsible to go to the object repository and get the new object information for each of these elements. First of all, identify which elements have changed. And then for each of the change elements, you are responsible to go get the new object information and replace existing information in the repository with the new information. So what Autonomic does is it automates this entire process. In other words, whenever the application changes, Autonomic will identify which elements have changed, and for each of the elements, it will identify the new object information and will heal existing repository for the existing fields with the new object information so that your executions will continue to work as expected without you making any changes to the repository. That's the second feature, autonomous maintenance. The third feature is API testing. So in addition to the functional testing and the UI testing that we talked about so far, you can also perform API testing. The idea is within the same test case, again in all in English, you can have few steps that interact with the UI and few steps that maybe invoke an API, get the response back, and verify whether the response that is returned back matches something on the screen. So, for example, the first few steps could be you're entering all the information into a form, and then you submit the form, and then the fifth or sixth step could be you're invoking the API or calling an API, getting the response back, and verifying if that API response matches the information on the screen. And the fourth feature is the same logic applied to databases. Just like how you did API testing, you can also do database testing. You can invoke a database query, get the result set back, and use the result set to verify if the application data matches the backend data, the database data. So in other words, within the same test case, you can do UI functional testing as well as API testing as well as database testing, and all in English. The fifth feature is being able to create test cases from scratch. And what I mean by that is, in the first feature that we talked about, if you had English test cases, you can import them into Autonomic and generate automation scripts. But what if you didn't have English test cases to begin with? In the past, we have seen where a lot of our customers don't have any kind of documentation, don't have good documentation for the test cases. So what we do is we have a plugin, a test case design plugin, which you can invoke. And essentially it works like a recorder. You record the test cases. And once the recording is done, you can save the recording and it saves the English test case file. So unlike any other recording in the world, which would record the script itself, record the technical information, the technical object information, Autonomic's recorder or Autonomic's test case design studio records an English test case, a plain English test case, and saves it for you. The advantage is, of course, it's in English, so anybody can look at the test case and know exactly what's happening. The second advantage is it's an excellent source of documentation for you. If you don't have documentation, this will be your documentation. I mean, you have a step-by-step test case, so anybody can look at the test case and know what's happening. And also, since the entire test case is in English, when the application changes, Autonomic can maintain the created script from the English test case for the lifetime of the test case. In other recorders, when the application changes, the script will fail, and you are responsible for changing the object information for the script. But in Autonomic, since it records an English test case to begin with, it automatically maintains the English test case and the associated scripts when the application changes for the lifetime of the script. The sixth feature is being able to execute scripts on different combinations of platforms and browsers. So as you can imagine, we are a part of Sauce Labs, so we also have integration with Sauce Labs. And you can execute our scripts that we generate in Autonomic on Sauce virtual machines and Sauce real devices seamlessly. So essentially, you can trigger the execution and it can execute it on Mac, Safari, or Mac Chrome, or Windows Edge or Windows Chrome, or whatever combination of platform and browser. And we also have plugins with CI/CD tools such as Jenkins, where you could make Autonomic a part of your CI/CD pipeline. And whenever you're ready to build your application, it can automatically trigger the test case executions from Autonomic, and it'll post the results on Jenkins. Now, what advantage these functionalities provide to an automation engineer? Creating an automation script from a manual test case takes a long time. With Autonomic, you can do that within minutes. As I said earlier, you can simply upload the English test case and generate the automation script for the test case within minutes. Similarly, when the application changes, you have to manually maintain the repository and manually add the appropriate steps if the business logic changes. Now, when the application changes, when the object information changes, Autonomic can autonomously heal your repository and your scripts with the latest object information. And when the business logic changes, all you got to do is just add the appropriate English steps in the UI, in the Autonomic UI, or in the Excel file that you want to import into Autonomic, and Autonomic will autonomously generate the script for the new steps. So again, something that will take you hours can be done in a matter of minutes. So what we have seen over existing implementations is an improvement of somewhere between 4x, 5x to maybe 7x, 8x, in productivity compared to automating using traditional methods. So without further ado, let's take a look at how these things happen live in action. Here's Autonomic. And essentially what you see is once you log in, you see the dashboard. On the dashboard, you see all the key information pieces of information. For example, things like the success percentage of your test suites, success percentage of your test cases, top failures, etc. So this can be consumed by a manager, a testing manager or a VP of engineering, and they will know exactly where they are in the release cycle. Now you can go to the project dashboard where you see a list of all the projects. Let's go into the project. And what we'll do now is we will import a test case as we discussed earlier and its associated test data file, and we will generate the automation script. So we'll upload the test case. We will upload the associated test data file. And we will associate the appropriate artifact, which is required for MFA. And once the test case and the test data files are imported, you can start the script generation process. Now, again, as I said, you can choose to execute or choose to generate the script on different combinations of platforms and browsers. For now, we'll just choose local Chrome, and we'll start the generation process. Now, what it's doing is it's going through every single step in the test case. And for each step, it identifies the appropriate nouns, verbs, adjectives, the appropriate parts of speech. And for each step, after it identifies once it knows what's the label, once it knows what's the action, it will scan through the page, identify the appropriate label on the page, and it identifies the appropriate element for that label. For example, here in case of username, the appropriate element is the text box itself. So it identifies the text box from the label, and it computes the unique object information for the text box, generates automation script, and proceeds to the next step. Similarly, you can do that it does it for password, login, etc. So as you can see here, it also handles multi-factor authentication within Salesforce. You can click on Leads tab, click on No Thanks button. So as you can see, all you have done so far is you have expressed the test case in English. And before we jump further, let's take a quick look at how the test case looks like. So this is the test case. Now, if you see, there is about 8 or 10 different columns in the test case. Now, Autonomic provides you complete flexibility on how you design your test case. There is no specific way you have to design your test case. For example, you could have your steps and data on as the first 2 columns, or you could, in this case, you have the the test steps as the 8th column or 10th column, and the test data as the 6th column. So it gives you complete flexibility because there's a one-time setting in Autonomic that you can do, where once you provide the setting, it will know exactly how to read your test cases going forward. So here, steps steps are defined in column H and data is defined in column F. And if you look at the steps, everything, enter username, enter password, click on login, click on Leads tab, click on No Thanks button, click on New button, enter name in the last name text box, enter company. Everything is in English. There is no XPath information. There is no object information. There is no technical information in the test case. And if you look at the appropriate test data file, this is how the test data file looks like. So you have all the fields you want to enter the data for, and you could have subsequent rows as data. So Autonomic can actually execute or generate the script against all the rows of data that you have in the test data file. This can be very handy for data-driven testing, where you want to run a test case against multiple sets of data, both maybe positive sets of data, negative sets of data, etc. And as you can see here, for certain cases, for example, mobile, street, city, etc., there is a specific set of information being used. Whereas for email or for phone, there is a regular expression, there's a pattern being used. And this is exactly where the feature that I talked about early during the demo comes into picture. In other words, you can generate data on the fly so that your executions will always be successful, because it always has fresh data. So here we are ensuring that for every execution iteration, the data will be unique and fresh. Now going back to the test case that was getting executed. So you can see, click on Leads tab, verify Leads tab, which on the leads on the screen. Click on New, enter name in the last name text box, enter company, and as you can see, company is misspelled. And if you recollect, company was also misspelled in the original Excel file. And although company is misspelled, it's still able to identify the right company on the screen. It's able to identify the right text box on the screen, and it's able to proceed further. And this happens because of a technique called fuzzy logic. So what it's saying is, hey, I wasn't able to find company with the incorrect spelling, but I was able to find the company with the correct spelling, and I'm 86% confident that it's the right element. And that's what it did, and it proceeded further. So essentially, at the end of the day, in a few minutes, it will complete the script generation. As you can see, the script is completed. Now you can execute the script on a different combination of platform and browser, or you can create a suite and add your test cases to the suite and execute the entire suite. Now, before we go into that, let me quickly talk about the flows. So a flow is nothing but a reusable component. So as you can imagine, there is a login, there is lead creation, maybe there is maybe account creation. There could be so many different parts of your test case that you might want to incorporate within other test cases that you might want to execute over and over again. So we don't want you to write or rewrite those test steps over and over again, although you want to execute them multiple times. So what we have is the concept of reusable components that we call flows. And essentially what you do in the flow is you you add all the steps you want to create or you want to execute over and over again into the flow. And like we did here in case of login. So open website and username, password, click on login, click on no thanks button. So so on and so forth. So you can add all those steps in the login flow, and you can simply invoke this login flow from your test case. So how would you do that? It's very simple. Let's say we go and create a brand new test case. By the way, the first feature we showed you was where you can upload a test case from an Excel file, which had English steps and generate automation scripts. You can also choose to create a step in English right here. So you could just say, I want to run that flow. So as you can see here, login flow automatically gets populated. And when you generate the script, it will get the appropriate steps for login and use that in the test case. Okay. So going back to the flows, so that's how you can create reusable components and you can use them going forward. Now coming back to suites, you can create a suite and you can, by the way, you can add email addresses so that these email addresses will receive the reports of the suite execution. You can add your list of test cases to the suite, and you can also arrange them. So let's say you want new test case 1 to be executed, at the first step, and then you want new test case 2 to be executed next, and then maybe 3 to be executed next. You could arrange these test cases so that they execute in that order. Now, this could be useful, especially when you have dependencies between different test cases. So, for example, let's say you are passing some information from new test case 1 to new test case 2. And if you want to pass information, you might want to execute them serially. So in that case, you can set the order of execution so that they execute in that order. You can also automate execution of other suites upon the completion of the execution of the current suite. For example, let's say you have two suites. One is, let's say, a sanity suite, and second is regression suite. You want to make sure that you execute the sanity suite first, and only if the sanity suite is successful, you want to trigger the execution of the regression suite. You could automate those things using post action. Now, once the suite is created, as you can see, this is a suite. You can choose to execute the suite as well. So these are the test cases in the suite, and let's say you choose to execute the suite. You can choose different combinations of platforms and browsers, and you can either choose to execute the suite in parallel fashion or in serial fashion. If you execute them in parallel fashion, depending on the number of threads available, it will execute n number of scripts in parallel, and it will fetch you the results in much faster. But if there's dependencies, you might want to execute them in serial fashion so that they execute in the right order to respect the dependencies. Now, once you execute the suite, you can see the reports on the reports page. So here's where you see a list of all the reports for all the test cases that have been executed in the past. So for example, this is a list of all the suites that have been executed in the past. You can go look at the execution history of each and every suite. Okay, and as you can see, what you see here is a list of all the suites, for all the iterations that each and every suite has been executed for. So for example, this suite has been executed 3 times in the past, and for each iteration, you can see how many test cases passed, how many test cases failed. You can download a detailed report, and the report will contain step-by-step information of what steps passed, what steps failed, etc. Now let's take an example of this report. Let's say I want to view the report, the detailed report of this test case. I will allow pop-ups. So this is how the report looks like, and I can click on any step and I can see information about that step. Now, by default, during execution, the screenshots are turned off, but if you turn on the screenshots, it will also have the screenshot for that step in the execution report. You can also filter the report by passed or failed or stopped steps. So this is the detailed step-by-step report of the test case. Now, one last thing I want to show you is schedules. Now, of course, while you are executing your suites, you may not have, you might have a lot of test cases in the suite, and you might want to execute the suites overnight or at a scheduled fashion. And if you want to do so, what you can do is you can create a schedule. And essentially, when you create a schedule, you can say, I want to execute this suite starting maybe today at 3:30 p.m. until the next month, 26th of May, 4:15 p.m. And you can say, I want to execute this every 24 hours. And you can say whether you want to execute this in serial fashion or in parallel fashion, and the same thing, right? What combinations of platforms you want to execute. You can also select execute this in multiple platforms and multiple browser combination. But at the end of the day, what you're saying here is you're saying that I want to execute this suite at a specific interval, starting from a specific date, ending at a certain date. And once you create the suite, or once you create the schedule, you will see a list of all the schedules here. And you can either pause the execution of the schedule, or you can resume it if it's already paused. And it will continue to execute the suite at that at that certain interval, until the end date. You can also modify, you can also edit the schedule information here from here if you want to update it. You can also view its execution history, which will take you directly to the reports page, where you can see a list of all the iterations it has executed for that suite, and you can see how many test cases passed, how many test cases failed, and you can view more details about each of the test cases. So that concludes the demo. Now what we have seen so far is how you can take an existing test case, import that into Autonomic, generate automation scripts for the test case, generate data for the test case, how you can use fuzzy logic, or how Autonomic uses fuzzy logic to ensure that even if there is certain spelling errors or certain user errors in the test case, how Autonomic can sanitize that and ensure that it generates right script. We also saw how you can, how once the generation is done, how you can execute the script. We also saw how reusable components are created and used. We also saw how you can create a suite, add multiple test cases to the suite, and execute the suite. We also saw how we can see the report for each iteration of the suite execution. And finally, we also saw how you can create a schedule and how you can have that schedule execute at a certain frequency for the lifetime of the execution, of the execution schedule. So thanks so much for your time, and looking forward to answering any questions you might have.